My name is Joshua Gibson, and you are listening to the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast, a show dedicated to promoting a message of critical thinking as it pertains to strength training, nutrition, and well-being. This is done through interviews with experts, high-level athletes, coaches, and people heavily involved in strength sports and athletic development. Pull up a chair, grab a coffee, and let's get on to today's podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Gibson, and the show itself, the podcast itself, seems to take different turns based on kind of where I'm at, my interests, and then also like the guests who have been on the show, and then kind of led to this pattern of more of a psychology orientation, or more performance and kind of in the weeds programming or technical or research focused work. And it seems like the last 5 to 10 episodes have been more strongly oriented towards social psychology kind of generally, and that's going to be no different for this episode. So I'm very, very honored to welcome Dr. David Puder, the host of the Psychiatry and Psychotherapy podcast, which has been one of my favorites, continues to be. And I would say I've probably reposted more episodes of that within the last few weeks than I've probably posted anything else, or even thought about posting anything else. It's been kind of like an all-consuming thing. A few episodes I would kind of recommend to people just before they dig into this one, if they're interested in exploring a little bit more for context. David did a few episodes on the hero's journey. He did a few on free will. He's done some book reviews on meditations by Marcus Aurelius, and then Crime and Punishment. So there are a lot of great episodes that would provide a lot of great context for the conversation we're about to have. So Dr. David Puder, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I appreciate you inviting me on, and I understand you're at UC Berkeley, which is my old school that I went to. So it's kind of cool that we have that.
Yeah, it was actually, I think I maybe have mentioned this on the podcast, but how that internship with the strength staff kind of started, it was just a bit, it was entirely circumstantial. And then I realized, and I've realized this over time, that UC Berkeley has a tremendously strong academic history. And when I say that, it's not like they've had really good people, and it's like, no, I was walking down, it might've been Shattuck, and it's like a street in Berkeley, but there was a painting of Howard Gardner on one of the, I don't know if it was like a newspaper stand or something, like on the side of the street. And I was like, oh, I didn't realize he had been here, or he had that much of an impact on the school. And then Thomas Kuhn, who wrote kind of like a really well-known book on the structure of scientific revolutions. And the names and the people and the accolades kind of go on and on and on. And it's something that you definitely feel on the campus. Even with the football team, Aaron Rodgers, it's his alma mater, and I think the locker room is named after him. It's the Aaron Rodgers locker room, and he's kind of enshrined there as like the guy. So you can kind of feel that.
Yeah. I have a funny story about him. So I used to actually, I was a part of a student organization when I was there that he was a part of, and I was one of the leaders in it. And it was like somewhere around 3 months into this football season, I'm like walking by the stadium, and I see this huge picture of him. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's my buddy Aaron. Oh, and then I find out he's like this big deal, and I'm like, oh, that's why when he rides around on a scooter, he always covers his face. Because he became quite the celebrity while he was even in college. But it was fun. I remember watching him, I think, triple overtime USC, and winning that game. That was fun.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So I guess this is actually a great, we kind of started with a bit about Aaron Rodgers' background, but I was curious to know more about your own because listening to the podcast, listening to the shows you've been on, um, consuming a bit of your work, I understand a little bit about how you got into psychiatry. I think you made a post that I saw a few times on Instagram about matching and
Yep.
not matching and seeing psychiatry, and then there this like transitioning or this transition happening. Um, so I'd love to hear about your background, kind of in academics, and then honestly in sport too, because I noticed that you are at you're I don't know if it's an affiliate gym, but you're at a starting strength gym or affiliate gym. So I know you're into like weightlifting, strength training. I know you're a proponent of that. You've done a handful of episodes on strength training and the effects that has on someone's health and well-being. So I'd love to get into your background so we can kind of then start to explore more recent topics.
Yeah. So I, grew up, um, I had parents who didn't really care about sports. Um, my dad would come to the football game that I played on, and he would say things like, "Wow, your band is really great." My brother was an ultimate fighter. He was 2 years older than me, so he was a wrestler and then became an ultimate fighter. He won Tough
Wow.
Enough, $1 million Tough Enough. So he was influential in getting me into wrestling. So I was a football player, wrestler, um, and then one day I had the thought maybe I'll row in college.
Mm,
So I just kind of wrote letters to all the teams that had rowing teams, and UC Berkeley was one of them. And the coach there was very open for walk-ons, and
mm,
it wasn't like the national champion in rowing for 6 years before I got there in a row, right? So the coaches were just top shelf, still are, and I was excited about being a part of something like that because there was just so much excellence around me. And, I had no idea what I was walking into. A lot of these guys had rowed already in the Olympics, and were recruited to Cal to row for college. So it was like I was rowing with these Olympians from day one, um, or national champions, top shelf rowers from all around the world. And so I naively just worked hard, and made the freshman boat.
mm.
So I was in the top 8 guys out of like 20 or 25 guys. And then I continued to row. And I think my senior year as a team, we won the national championship. I got second in a 4. So I was stroking the 4 at that point. And another connection with the football team, we had the strength and conditioning coach who was the top strength and conditioning coach as our as our strength coach when I was at Cal. So there was a cool connection there with the football team as well. And so, I was very motivated to move on with life after that. I went to medical
Mhm.
school for 4 years. I probably could have gone further, tried to go for the Olympics, but in rowing, there wasn't any money behind it. I didn't have family money to go do that for like 4 years. It's like, um, I wanted to get through medical school, get married, have a family. And so that's what I did. And, yeah, initially I was thinking orthopedic surgery, spent some time in Santo Domingo, Haiti, shadowing a really good orthopedic surgeon. He's still over there. Dr. Scott Nelson, world-class pediatric orthopedic surgeon. I mean, like literally world-class. There are everyone who is in that realm looks up to him.
Mm.
And he's doing the most wild, the quickest, the best surgeries, and he's doing it at the highest level over there, which is really cool. Kind of like a Paul Farmer, but someone who doesn't really brand himself very well, probably.
Mhm.
Um, but I didn't love orthopedic surgery. I loved meeting the Haitians, talking to the residents, the medical students. They actually have a medical school out there. And I just noticed more and more I was very relational. So I thought internal medicine, pediatrics, and then like what I posted before, it's like, you apply to 20 programs, and I didn't get in. And I had like awesome board scores. I had there were like a couple things that I struggled with that maybe got red flagged, but overall I thought I was a pretty strong candidate. But on my interview trail, I talked a lot about lifestyle, talked about
Mm,
diet, talked about exercise, and I had read all these studies looking at how for diabetes, like how important it was to catch it early and do this lifestyle stuff. And I was excited to try to get the patients to change their lives. And I would meet everyone on the interview trail with like blank stares. Like, do you realize like how hard it is to change someone's, you know, lifestyle? Right. And I think I was a little bit naive
mm,
it's very hard for people to make changes. Um, but anyways, when I found out I didn't match anywhere, I had a thought that came to my mind. It felt like almost like a hallucination of sorts, a psychiatry, right? I heard in my mind psychiatry, and I was like, I don't want to do psychiatry, but I'll think about it. So I did another rotation, and I liked it more. And then I realized like, oh, these are my people. Like these are the residents I get along with the best. We have the deepest discussions. We have these philosophical discussions. We have these like interpersonal discussions,
mm,
and like I really enjoyed that group of people more than you know the jock. They kind of like the strong sensor jock, with is kind of the orthopedic surgeon, or the very sort of intellectual but no emotion person maybe goes into something more non-surgical but analytical, right? So I wasn't fitting into those categories as a feeler myself, and so psychiatry made sense. So I went into psychiatry, and I actually fell in love with it more and more. It's like it's such a good fit for me. Psychotherapy
mm.
became more and more fascinating. um, I was trying to break things down into the smallest components of like, how do I make sense of this? I had a great analyst teacher. He's like 97 now, Dr. John Tarr. He was just phenomenal. Like still one of the best teachers, therapists, supervisors I've ever experienced. And so I stayed on at Loma Linda to basically co-teach with him since it's been about 10 years. So every Thursday we still co-teach together, and I still learn from him. And then I moved to Florida 2 years ago, set up more of a private practice. And, about 5 years ago, I started the podcast, and that's been going well. I think we passed something like 4 million downloads.
Wow.
So that's been a lot of fun because, what it's like. You get to hang out with people that are maybe you wouldn't have a context for hanging out with otherwise.
Hmm.
And you have a reason and a purpose to spend time with them.
Express the passion that defines you. At Virus, we understand that when it comes to performance, the slightest edge can mean the difference between winning and losing. Each product is designed and tested with performance in mind. This principle inspired the technology that is infused into our apparel. Built with the intention to move with you and work for you, we create tools meant to help express the passion that defines you. The future of technology-driven apparel. Improve performance, prevent fatigue, recover faster, and go further. Virus is a proud sponsor of Josh Gibson and the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. Use code PHILWL for 10% off at checkout. That's PHILWL, PHILWL, for 10% off.
Yeah, and I think you kind of mentioned how I guess like what you tended to gravitate towards, like you were more relational, and you tended to kind of talk to people and think about lifestyle factors and how those could be changed, how that kind of shaped where you eventually ended up, which was psychiatry, and then kind of going into that and realizing like, oh, this may be a better fit or is a better fit, just based on who I am, or what I tend to do or how I tend to do it. How I would be curious to know though how that actually did change you. So you talked about how you were kind of a better fit for it, but once you got into psychiatry, or starting to understand more about psychotherapy and become, you know, more educated, kind of just generally in that field, and understanding like all the different forms of therapy and the different techniques, and all of the information that could kind of assist you in treating um, different conditions, I guess. How did that change you as a person, going into it knowing that you were like more fit for it, and then coming out of it? Um, can you reflect back on that a little bit?
Yeah. So how did the training change me, and how did, I would say, being in the training, I was encouraged to do my own therapy. And so I've had, I think, 3 therapists. I just saw my therapist this morning. It's been a part of my journey to kind of have some continued experiential learning through doing my own therapy, which I would say, if you're thinking about this field, that's probably the best teacher. Uh, the didactics, the learning, the books has value. And obviously you've participated in that by listening to my podcast. You've soaked up some of the pearls, but there's something about seeing patients and then having a process of supervision therapy where you're reflecting about the patients, which causes a nice continuous growth in your abilities and understanding and patience and kindness, empathy. I think I was always a people watcher, and I was always a peacekeeper. I was naturally someone who felt other people's emotions, found ways of, developing relationships with meaningful people through that ability. But I think as I've grown, um, it's, I sort of deepened my conscious understanding of human nature and the human dynamics, and also experientially by being in therapy or being in supervision, or even I've done some marriage therapy at this point. It's like at every step it definitely raises your EQ.
Mm.
Like, I think my EQ is quite a bit higher than it was in medical school. So like just accurately reading people, accurately reading yourself, I would say is kind of a summary of what EQ is, emotion quotient or whatever, And I think that's increased. And so, nowadays I have people who are in the top of their fields who come to me for therapy, who are very high EQ people to start with. You have to be successful to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
But I still find that they are not seeing things very accurately in some domains of their life, usually attachment relationships. We tend to be blinder to what's going on once we actually get into an attachment with someone, because it stirs up a lot of old stuff from our childhood and old attachment figures, stuff like that. So someone could be very high EQ in their professional life, but naive, almost reactionary in their attachments. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what came to my mind when you asked me that.
No, I think it was a great answer, and I think it honestly it kind of sets this framework of discussing therapy just generally. And I recently started seeing a therapist, probably a few months ago. Not exactly sure of the timeline, but I've been lifting weights and resistance training now for a decade, probably going on 10 and a half years. You close going to be closing in on 11 around June, which is funny that that anniversary is something that stuck so strongly to me. But I have resistance trained, competed in the sport of weightlifting, Olympic weightlifting, and coached powerlifting, done all of that, relatively successfully. I mean, at least well enough to be doing it, 8-10 years later. And that being like the thing I'm pursuing in academics, and then also the thing that's like allowing me to live my life the way I want to live it. And I started thinking about that from the context. I think it was in May of 2022 that I finished the book, and I started getting interested in like culture, and like team culture, and sport culture, and interpersonal relationships, and I read Emotional Agility by Susan David, and I remember that book being special and kind of having like this transformative power. And I had gotten into philosophy and psychology well before that. I think the first book I read that was really impactful was actually Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. I remember that was like 10 years ago. I read that, and then I started getting into Stoicism. I read Letters from a Stoic by Seneca.
Mm,
I read Lucretius and Epictetus, and
okay.
I started going through all those books. And that was like, and then I got into Eastern philosophy. I read a ton of Alan Watts' stuff. Um, I kind of explored that landscape. I think it was largely because it was easier to read. And what I mean by that is it's not like riddled with logic or riddled with complexity or riddled with these like theoretical ideas. They're very grounded in this is what it means to be a person who's living this, like living out an existence within this situation. Um,
Mm,
and I found that very applicable and very, very interesting to start to try to conceptualize human experience as something beyond what you're kind of captured within. And what I
mm,
mean by that, I guess, to give an example, is Alan Watts did refer to it as this game. And I think when you listen to Stephen Hayes talk about, identity and self-identity, he talks about getting in this clown suit. And it's just that ability, I guess, to step back and recognize that it's something beyond just like what you're experiencing. And I guess we're gonna have a lot of conversations that branch off of that with respect to emotion. But to not derail my train of thought too much, I read Emotional Agility by Susan David, and that was like a book that kind of started to clue me in on, oh, you can have emotions and thoughts that are maybe unwanted, and they aren't you. There's something that's happening, and you can. I don't know if this would hold, but like you can more or less remove yourself from them, or just acknowledge them and recognize them, and not feel like you're enslaved to them. Um,
you are the one that observes the
yeah,
emotions.
that's right. That's right.
Kind of
So I read that book, and that started this process of getting interested in it more and more and more, and then eventually it was like, oh, it just makes sense to see a therapist. And then I actually found someone who's a psychotherapist. The first conversation we had was about ACT and Stephen Hayes, and I've been seeing him for a while now. He's an incredible guy. I really enjoy talking to him. I just had a session the other day, and that was really helpful. And I've found that like having this like non-judgmental space to be
yeah.
open and to experience kind of like myself, um, and to have someone to help kind of process that with has been really useful in being able to do that with other people, like not to do it with them, but like to share myself with them and to be open. So coming from you, for people who aren't, I don't have any statistics, or I don't have an understanding of how often people see a therapist or go to therapy, and then how you would also say that's like consistent from person to person, because there are I'm assuming a ton of different therapeutic approaches. But from you, what is therapy? What's the goal of psychotherapy? What's the goal of therapy? um, and why did you see it as such like a critical part of your life, or why do you see it as that?
It's a really good question, and I think it's really cool how you're such a seeker, and you're so curious. And so it's like, imagine you take that curiosity, and just like anything else, like at one point I got really curious about swimming, so I watched a
Mm,
bunch of YouTube videos on swimming, and I got to be a pretty good swimmer from just watching YouTube videos. But then imagine I want to get to that next level. It's like, yeah, you're going to need like a coach or someone to be outside of you that's participating in your experience, or observing you or empathizing with you. Interestingly, like whatever therapy, like modality is practiced, is not that important actually. Like there's a lot of studies, for example, that look at acceptance commitment therapy versus cognitive behavioral therapy, and they're pretty equivalent. What's not equivalent is a good therapist versus a bad
mm,
therapist. And so my my sort of journey is a curiosity into what's called like something called therapist effect, where some therapists and some psychiatrists are just better than the average therapist or psychiatrist. You know, there's one study, for example, that one psychiatrist's imipramine, which is a tricyclic antidepressant, was not as good as another psychiatrist's placebo. So something is happening beyond just a medication, if that's the case. And we know what it is. It's therapeutic alliance, the ability to connect with another human being, connection, and the ability to build trust between two people, and the ability to have to handle difficult interpersonal feedback. So like therapy, like let's say you felt some anger, or you felt some resentment or bitterness or envy towards your therapist. That's like good stuff to bring into the therapy session. And a good therapist will know what to do with it. He won't feel threatened by it. He won't feel judgmental or defensive. So like seeing the therapist as kind of like the container or the way to process attachments from the past. You know, like for me, I think when I had my third therapist, which was truly excellent, it's my current therapist, I was just surprised when she would react with compassion and empathy. And I'm still surprised. Like, you know, there's part of me that's kind of like punitive, and I was probably a lot more judgmental than I am now, but there's still parts of myself that judge myself. Right. And critical towards myself. I'm kind of wired to be maybe higher guilt or higher self-criticism, or, you know, and so when I imagine she will respond that way. And when she doesn't, it's like, it's actually very healing. So it's little things like that, transference, you know, like transferring over some of the unmet needs of my childhood, getting those met through therapy. You know, what is therapy? Therapy is what the problem the person comes in with, and through relationship, finding some healing. And how that happens is complicated, and I'm not sure we fully understand it, but we do know that it happens better if there's a good connection, and we can actually measure connection. That's some research that I've done in the supervision setting. I've actually looked at how to measure connection, and we know that connection, when it's really strong, is healing, and when it's not there, it's just not so much healing. And when it's like the opposite of connection, it can be damaging, right? And this is where I would say for coaches too, like the best coaches, the players feel like there's a common goal, and there's trust, and this coach has some level of empathy. I can remember back to one race in which we went off too hot. So we went off at a stroke rate, which was way beyond what we were ready for. And I was so in the tank by that last 250 meters, 500 meters, you know, like it's hell. Like you are in a lactic acid bath at that point. Right. And, and, you know, I felt defeated. We lost. It was a horrible race. And we lost to like our number one rival, right? Which is awful. It's like, they're the people we want to beat the most. And I think I'd only lost like a couple races before this too, ever. Right. So it's like, there's that as well. And the coach came up to us and he got angry that we went off too hot, which kind of was like empathy for me. He said, you guys weren't ready to go off at that rate. That's not all of your fault. He said, but that was, so he got angry at that. And then he was like, you know, you guys are, you know, like he looked at us with complete confidence and he said, you guys are going to beat this team, just not today. And there was, it kind of like jolted me out of this like shutdown place, dissociation, which I didn't know at the time was dissociation. It's like when you're kind of like a little bit less in your body, or you're just kind of like shut down, you know? And, it got us fighting again every day, you know, every day we show up to practice and it's like, today is the national championship. Today, what you do today is going to manifest in in the competition. Like the focus, the attention, the effort that you bring today is going to be what translates to winning. That was a message we got every day, and we believed it with him, you know. And Gladstone is the best college rowing men's coach of all time. He is, and not perfect by any means, but he's over at Yale now, and he's once again building an amazing program. And the guys look amazing when they row, and it's really awesome to watch. So yeah, I don't know. That's a long answer to your question. What is psychotherapy? I guess in the same way that a good coach connects with an athlete, and through that connection, the athlete can weather some of the tough aspects of, victory and defeat, right? The highs and the lows. I think a therapist can be that connection for us for the highs and lows of life.
Wow. And you mentioned a few things that I'd like to touch on. You mentioned therapeutic alliance when you were explaining the differences in therapeutic approaches, and you have an incredible series on therapeutic alliance on your podcast. I listen to that not so much because I'm thinking about, like, as a therapist, how it would connect with patients, but like, what are these overarching qualities that you could display or have that would deepen or create a better connection just with people you're close with. And I thought that was like a really great resource. And you mentioned a few there when you were talking about empathy and compassion. And a question I'd have stemming off that, if we're thinking about just interpersonal relationships, kind of separating ourselves from like the clinic, knowing that I know for a fact that I have maybe one or two people who are listening to this who are in psychology or are working with clients or patients. So for a vast majority of people, but they'll have interpersonal relationships, friendships, significant others, family members. And when thinking about how to best connect with people or to relate with people or to be a part of their life, what can we learn from the way, I think a good example is like Carl Rogers, the way a great therapist approaches the relationship with a patient. And I know, Carl will talk about empathy and positive regard and these other qualities. So maybe you can talk about, from your perspective, what creates a great interpersonal relationship.
Hey, what's up, weightlifters? Danny here, founder of Onyx Weightlifting Co., a leather accessories company specializing in weightlifting gear. In our shop, we make gear that doesn't get in the way of your performance because we understand that hitting lifts requires your full attention. Our straps, wrist wraps, and belts are designed to be comfortable and reliable, so all you need to do is make lifts. Thanks for listening to our friend Josh's podcast. You can continue to support him by visiting our online shop at onyxstraps.com and using his code PHILWL. That's PHILWL at checkout. See you on the platform.
It's a good focus, because we want to translate these things beyond the clinical and like what lessons can we learn that are broader. And I would say that empathy is poorly practiced by most people, and there's kind of like a pop culture understanding of empathy, and then maybe there's what I think of when I think of empathy. So what empathy is it's not sympathy. It's not saying I feel sorry that this happened to you. That's sympathy. Empathy is actually very hard if you feel envious or jealous of another person. So imagine someone comes to you with a success and you're like, well, I deserve that, or I want to have that success, and that's going through your mind, either consciously or unconsciously. You may not be able to celebrate that success with that person, right? And that person will then feel that empathy gap and be less likely to share anything with you. So empathy is hard, especially in like high competitive driven people, because they're naturally more envious. And so like, what is it that keeps us from empathy, I think, is a better question, and if we can remove those things, then we may be able to have better empathy. So where are the empathy gaps that I see often? One is people are stuck in their own experience. And so, your conceptualization of what happened may not align with their conception of what happened. I had a friend who lost his father, and his father died. And he said, everyone wants me to be sad. Everyone comes to me and he says, oh, it must be so sad. He's like, I feel relief. And I feel guilty that I don't feel sad because my dad was an awful person. People don't know that because I'm not going to tell all those stories to people. And I said, so my empathy for him at that point, I think I said something like, it makes sense to you that it's just so hard to hear other people wanting you to be in a place that you're not. Like, it makes sense that you feel some relief. Your dad was a lot. You fathered him at the end of his life. He didn't father you. He stopped fathering you. I don't think he ever really fathered you. He was always in his own experience. And, you could sit here and be listening to this and thinking about your own situation. But with this particular person, that was empathy for him because his father ran away from the home at an early age when he was young and did whatever he wanted and left this kid to raise his brothers and take care of the mother type of thing. So it was a burden for him, but no one knew that. So it was like, there's an empathy gap there. So for empathy, we need to be prepared to be surprised, and we need to be prepared to not know, and then be able to look at someone else and hear their story and read them properly. That's where I think micro expression comes in. It's like reading what actually is there, and then if we're an accurate barometer ourselves for their experience, which is called affective empathy, feeling in ourselves what another person is feeling, which some people have really good affective empathy, but poor cognitive empathy. Cognitive empathy is the ability to express what the other person is feeling in words. So you could be a psychopath and have good cognitive empathy because a psychopath has low affective empathy by definition, right? Someone with psychopathy, like antisocial personality disorder, but psychopathy it's a different word for someone with low affective empathy and a lot of the other psychopathy checklist types things. Anyways, I hope I'm not confusing people at this point, but like you could have low affective empathy and high cognitive empathy by learning how to read people and respond, read their facial cues, hear what they say and respond. You can learn cognitive empathy. You can't learn affective empathy if you don't have it. If you do have it, but it's been shut off because of horrible things in your life, you can get more in tune with it. And I think over my career, I've been able to get more in tune with my natural affective empathy, where it's like a Geiger meter for what someone else is feeling at this point when I turn it on. And so that's my definition of empathy and what some of the things that get in the way of empathy. And empathy is central to the Therapeutic Alliance. And in my own study on connection, if empathy is low, all the other domains of connection will be low. And another domain of connection that might be of interest to your listeners is psychological safety. So psychological safety and empathy just kind of flow together, meaning if you're high in one, you're going to be high in the other. So psychological safety is the ability that you feel to take, or the security that you feel to take interpersonal risks, to tell someone the difficult thing that you need to say to them. So psychological safety is like, do you feel like you could go up to your coach and tell him when you disagree with him? Or do you feel like you could go up to your player and tell him or her that you have some concerns about something? Do you feel psychologically safe with this individual? So it's more of an experience, but it increases with empathy. As empathy is given, it increases. Okay. So it's so hard to really wrap someone's brain around the whole conceptualization of like what creates a good therapeutic alliance. But empathy is one thing that's a definite winner. There's, psychological safety. How do we increase psychological safety? Well, when someone gives you feedback, how do you respond to that? That teaches them. Do you respond with empathy, curiosity, non-judgmentalness, or do you respond with defensiveness? And I'm sure you can imagine good coaches who are very psychologically unsafe, but I would say most great coaches
Mm.
have some level of psychological safety with their key players, with their people.
Yeah, and hopefully the long pauses that I'm giving you aren't like me just like waiting for the conference. It's like this is so fascinating to me and so interesting and such a great explanation of, or a great answer to, I guess, the question I asked, that I'm almost just like uh really excited and curious to hear more. So thanks for kind of explaining that and explaining it so well. And honestly, to be transparent, I feel like effective empathy is something I've been working to allow to kind of express, not express itself, but to be more present. And it's something I feel like I've been working through, and thinking a lot about. And I feel like they're thinking back to how I used to coach, and just how I used to respond to situations that, um, in words I've used, would create a lot of like friction or arousal. As I used to just kind of like dissociate or shut down, and kind of like shut off. And I think you've mentioned it as stonewalling, and I don't know if that would fit, but it's kind of what it felt like. And to kind of remove myself from that, or not remove myself from it, but develop or allow this like reemergence of empathy, and an ability to connect, an ability to stay present and to be open. And you mentioned psychological safety, and I found that to be, one of the things that I think makes therapy such a great or invaluable kind of like part of my life, is like that, and like completely welcoming aspect of it, where it's as safe as you could probably get, at least, with respect to most relationships, because you don't have to worry about someone leaving. And I think there's a Jordan Peterson quote I like, where he's talking about marriage, and he says, he mentions that with marriage, you create this lifelong bond, or this commitment, so that you can completely show yourself to the other person and not worry about them leaving. And I think from my standpoint, when I think about like this non-judgmental space to be completely safe, that's like what therapy would be. And that kind of like sets this groundwork for being able to then take that in other places.
Mm.
So that's just like my personal experience of it, and kind of like how I've been kind of like processing the things you've mentioned.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, and then you did mention micro expressions, and that's a topic I wanted to get into a little bit more after having finished that book, where she talks about kind of like the classical view of emotion, and how there are like 6 emotions that are classically thought to be represented across cultures within people: disgust, anger, happiness. And those are a few examples, and how there's a common fingerprint for them. There's a predictable physiological response or expression of them, and then an experience of them. And then she goes on to make the argument against the classical view, with this constructionist view, that emotions are culturally bound, um, culturally experienced, and then individually experienced and expressed in unique and novel ways given the circumstances. And I guess that would kind of come back to like this self as context idea from ACT, where the context will largely display the experience of an emotion, or the expression of an emotion. And she uses a ton of different examples, where she might show a picture of Serena or Venus Williams, and have like this look, and it's like, oh, she's obviously angry, and it's like, no, she's playing a tennis match. Or and that could be wrong, and it could be misrepresenting what she was trying to show. But I just, hopefully, to paint the picture of, you can give this like small snapshot of something happening, but without the context you lose it, and without the understanding of everything surrounding it, you kind of lose a lot of the picture. And that's what, like, yeah, okay, without getting too long-winded, I'll kind of let you jump in, maybe to kind of discuss. I don't know, you said you leafed through that book, um you had some thoughts on it, so maybe you can kind of explain this idea of micro expressions and how that fits into, I guess, like broader idea of emotions and how they're expressed within and between people. I mean, this is like a massive question that wasn't super well formulated. So hopefully you can do something with it.
Yeah. Okay. So no, this is good. This is a good question. And when anyone's critical of microexpression and wanting to move away from this idea that there are these emotions that are expressed on the face that are scientifically valid, I just think to myself, has this person like ever tried to learn this before they're
Mm.
critical of it? So I actually have a like a training course for mental health professionals called Emotion. It's at a website called emotionconnection.com, and you can go on there and take a free test and see how good you are at catching these. And most people score at like 20 percentile.
Wow.
And so when anyone's critical of it, I always think to myself, like, have they ever really learned how to read it? And then number two, like, do they have any clinical experience, right? Because I've been using these things with patients, and it's phenomenal to increase the empathy. I'll give you a short example. I remember listening to this guy's story across. He was at a coffee shop, and he flashed a micro expression of anger, and then he talked about how this woman had taken his photo that he shot and like not given him, and had gotten in some reality show, and she was still using these photos, and no one ever gave him credit. Or it was like video he shot or something, and the micro expression of anger cued me into like, oh, this person's still upset about this, right? Like there's a pocket of emotion there. So I turned to him, and the barista wasn't being very responsive, and I didn't know this guy. I turned to him, we got eye contact, and I said, hey, I just want to let you know, like that would be really frustrating. Maybe even more, maybe like even anger. Just absolutely aggravating to have someone not express gratitude or any financial support for this thing that you did for free, or no, for, with the conception that there might be something there, but like you did this service. And anyways, I said something brief like that, and he turns to me and he said, and you could see his like whole body just let down in one moment. He just calmed down, right? He's like, wow, what's your name, bro? And it's like he wanted to then connect with me, and what was my name, get to know me. And so my experience is that microexpression can be so profound, because essentially there's these like 1/10 to 1/30th of a second flashes on the face. 1/30th of a second, like that's so fast. And at first you don't really know what to look for, but you're looking for something usually pretty symmetrical. You're looking for fear, for anger, for disgust. I look for pain as well. That's a little bit beyond Paul Ekman. Pain and disgust look very similar, but pain has the mouth stretch out wide. So with pain, the eyebrows come down and together. There's like a little, and the mouth goes wide. Anger, the eyebrows go down and together. That's a common one. Disgust, eyebrows go down and together, but the nose flares a little bit. Fear, the eyebrows go up and together. And sadness, the eyebrows, the middle part of the eyebrows just goes up. So there's like different expressions that are like your tells, so to speak. And this was used in the business world, and I've kind of brought it to psychotherapy. I'm the first one that I know that got really excited about this. I learned it, and then I started talking about it and integrating in psychotherapy. So I do training on this for people, and I talked about it in the podcast. And so I'm excited about it because it really helped me, number one, connect with people, but also myself. Like I can feel these expressions on my face when they happen. And then also when I was learning them, like Paul Ekman, he talks about them quite a bit. Like contempt is the one-sided smile, right? And also another word is pride. And he saw this as like very negative in all of his writing, but I actually see this as like often very positive. A lot of people, when they flash this, they're proud of something. They're proud of some accomplishment that their family member did or that they did. And so there's like, what do you say when you see this stuff? That's a question I've tried to answer to increase empathy in providers. And what kind of information does it give you? I think it gives good information. So I disagree that it's socially constructed or culturally constructed. It's in animals as well. Like animals will have micro expressions. Darwin wrote a book on emotion in faces. Humans all have it across all cultures. There's been tons of studies to look at that. Do the meanings of the emotion differ from different culture, or do the things that elicit disgust change based on different cultures? Absolutely. And that's where I would agree. And then I'll also agree with this kind of conceptualization of allowing someone to define their own experience. Like, of course, I would never tell someone, like, actually, you're feeling angry because you just flashed the emotion. That would be like the opposite of empathy. So it's like it's a useful tool, but inevitably, people have a more nuanced ability to express the things that are going on in themselves than just 7 or 8 core experiences. The other thing that I've noticed that Paul Ekman and a lot of researchers don't talk about is dissociation. So sometimes you can see a defocusing of the I in another person during a moment of trauma that they're discussing or something that's like overwhelming. And so to identify dissociation, I think is very powerful as well. But once again, these are tools to be able to kind of get to the core building blocks of what our emotional life is. And for a lot of people in sports, they've maybe had to shut down what their emotions are just to, man up and take care of business. And it's like emotions are not prized, but I think they could be prized. Like, I think if you understand emotion, you can use it as energy. Anger is the energy to overcome an obstacle. So it's like defining what the obstacle is, searching for a goal, and then trying to put words to and find the best way to overcome that obstacle. Right. That's what you could do if you have an anger micro expression around something. So seeing what the emotion pocket is can allow you to sort of get to what is underneath and what is important, and then you can move forward. So I don't know. It's just short, a short little summary of microexpression, but I'm curious, like, does that change your perspective at all after reading her book on this?
A question that I was kind of formulating as you were talking, and I guess this kind of would help me get to the heart of it and understand more, is I guess I don't know if this is the best question to lead with, but it's like, what is an emotion? So if you kind of mine down, and you mentioned that animals display them as well, these like expressions or micro expressions, or display the same like emotions, like core emotions. What are they, and how are we able to define them in a way that would remove it from being culturally bound? So you mentioned anger as being like, when there's an obstruction to goal related behavior, there could be this experience of anger. So I just wonder, like, to escape the cultural confines that we would live in, there would need to be this like, this aspect to it that transcends it and allows it to be understood beyond like a singular word, like anger, right? I guess it would be captured by anger, but it would be something like more general or generalizable, but also consistent from culture to culture, people, different animals, right? Uh, different beings, or I guess like organisms who can experience it. So I would wonder how we could kind of mine down to that, so that we could have this like consistent thing that we could then discuss on a podcast and label, but know that that's like just a way for us to understand something that transcends it, like transcends the label.
Yeah. So, is like, I think that I think that there is the subjective experience of someone, which they may or may not fully have conscious awareness of, right? And so the problem I have with some people's understanding of emotion is they only put it as like, what is your feeling? But a lot of, for example, high trait agreeableness females and males have an issue with getting in touch with their anger. And let's say you weren't allowed to express anger growing up. So the anger may come out passive aggressively. You may not have conscious awareness of the anger. You may have poor boundaries. You may be in more like relationships where you're not getting your needs met, but maybe meeting their needs. But the anger is there, and then it manifests in other ways. Like maybe the anger comes out as a like with more addiction type stuff, or more headaches, or more psychosomatic things, right? So it's like the experience of anger can get pushed into the unconscious, and you may not have conscious awareness of the anger, but it's still there. And I can see it on the face. It's a micro expression. It's a quick down and together of the eyebrows. There's people may not be consciously aware of it, but it's still there. So that's where I think I differentiate emotion from feelings. I think feelings are kind of like what your experience of the thing is, how you describe it. I run a program at Loma Linda University for psychosomatic patients. These are patients with medical issues that could also be seen as having a psychological origin. We also have patients in there with real physical issues like cancer and stuff like that. But a lot of psychosomatic illnesses are the inability to feel your emotions congruently. And so we may have them do art the first couple weeks, a lot of art. And they're like, why am I doing so much art? It's like, we're trying to get you to express, because you can't express it with words yet. We're trying to get you to express it with color, pictures, or can they express it in writing or poetry? So it's like, where do they express the truest form of their reality? So sometimes it comes out in dreams. I've had a lot of patients where it's like, what we talk about the most is their dreams, because it's the most congruent to their inner experience. We have to get at that inner experience to help them through what they're struggling with. So I think I took your question from a different angle of like, how do you see it a little bit? How do I see it differently than someone who says like emotions are just what you feel?
Right.
It's like, well, okay, but does that really help me in psychotherapy get them to where they want to go? Because if I just believe everything that someone says, but they've learned throughout their whole life to say a facade that isn't real, right. They're talking about the clown suit over and over again. Or like another example, I've had patients who come in and the way that they connect with professionals is through talking about medications. And so they want to talk about their genetic tests. They want to talk about the interactions of the medications. And if I was not tuned into their emotional realities and able to steer the conversation into an emotional one, they would just talk about meds every time. And that feels comfortable. I've seen the same thing with, I've worked with a couple of pastors, and they have people that come into their church and all they want to talk about is arguments in the Bible. Why? That's the way they've connected with pastors in the past. It's like, well, but is that the real core of what they're struggling with? Maybe they're not even talking about how they don't have any friends. Why don't they have any friends? So it's, like, are we getting to really what's core and what's important? That's why I'm like so for depth work and for doing the long-term psychotherapy. It's like, how long does psychotherapy take? Probably longer than you have patience for. Probably, a lot of people are listening probably like, I would never do therapy. And it's like, well, do you want to explore and understand yourself better? Yeah, absolutely. How do you think you'd best do that? By reading self-help books. Who wrote those self-help books? People who have never done therapy and never been in therapy often, how do you know that self-help book is like, is there any data to support that self-help books could help someone out of anxiety and depression? And, I would say a lot of my patients have read tons of self-help books before they see me, and it doesn't seem to, cure or help them beyond, giving them a lot of fancy words to describe things that maybe those fancy words are not best used to describe anyways. Maybe they use those fancy words now to distract themselves from what's really going on, because what's really going on is so embarrassing and so shameful that they can't even look at it. So if we're trying to get to really what's underneath, like and even looking at that yourself is so difficult. Like I'm talking to you about this, and I know it can be a little bit theoretical, but like today I just went to my therapist and I had like some issues sleeping last night, and there were some things on my mind, and I was thinking that the therapist was going to be upset at me for these things, and she wasn't. So it's like, I'm still in process over this. Now, those things that I talked about are consciously registered in me, whereas like 4 years ago, I wouldn't be able to consciously register them, you know? So it was like a part of my experience and a part of my emotional life, but I wasn't able to access it. And there was a bunch of defense mechanisms. So it's like now I'm able to see it a little bit better, but it's still the shame shrouds the true stuff there, right? And so this is where it's like so much more complicated than like just feel or just like all that self-help stuff is sometimes very superficial and therefore to me meaningless.
No, that makes sense. I think you kind of shared that with me, and then I'll share this with you. When you were saying that, like I absolutely love like reading. I mentioned a bunch of different books and listening to a bunch of different podcasts related to ACT and other just things related, because I can just use a lot of words to explain it. And then I started to feel somewhat targeted when you were explaining that, like, you could read all these self-help books and not get anywhere and have all this like intellectual knowledge, but kind of be at the same point at which you started. So I
you,
kind of
you felt
acknowledge
you felt personally targeted by me,
I
or
did.
did you feel like
I felt kind of. Go
was
ahead.
it targeted like in a good way or a bad way? Was it like
I think it's now that I have been like going to therapy to try to
yeah,
actually work through it, I didn't feel quite as much like shame.
okay.
But I definitely felt like I was being more and more kind of like aroused as you,
Oh,
were saying that.
well, I'm also speaking to an earlier version of myself. If you see my bookshelf, you will know what I'm talking about. It's like I think we're grasping and trying and we're trying. And I think, a lot of wisdom throughout the ages, like I love the classics, man.
Mm,
Love that you've read the Stoics, and I love, there's so much wisdom to gain from that, but I do think that there is something about the relationship. And it's like, is knowledge enough? And
mm,
sometimes it can be helpful. It can guide you. It encouraged you to get the therapy, but sometimes it can be it can like distance you almost
mm,
from the experience of life as well. And so it's like, when does it become a defense mechanism? And defenses are good. There's higher and lower order defenses. So I would say intellectualization, the defense against some emotion that maybe we can have from a lot of reading, is actually adaptive
mm.
and it's helpful. But it can also be maladaptive, like if you're connecting with your girlfriend and you're trying to and you're getting really theoretical, and she's like, I don't really feel connected with you. I don't know why, but you're like, no, but like, I'm telling you, this is how emotions are supposed to be made, blah, blah, blah. It's like, you can be like all in your left side of your brain as you talk about these things are really right-sided brain stuff, right? Which are experientially happening
Are
between
you
people.
listening into my phone calls?
I'm like, I am saying things right now, and sometimes it's a little bit like I'm reading a little bit of the situation. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe I'm responding. I like to respond to where people are at. So maybe this
Yeah.
is where you're at. If it's not, that's fine.
I will say, I think an interesting point you made, and this, I think this is kind of the process of diversifying your perspective. Is I read a lot of those books, from Marcus Aurelius and Seneca, and then you would hear people talk about Stoicism, and like what I would say the negative aspects of it would be, that it's like this, this like um, the word that comes to mind is like this, like stone kind of like uh inability, well, not inability, but like this drive to not experience or feel, and to kind of be like level in the face of adversity. And listening to you talk about it, that's not what it sounds like it is. So maybe, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I think stoicism is actually a way to more deeply feel
Hmm.
at times. Now, you're not maybe allowing those feelings to control you in a way that would be negative, but you are not I don't think you, as if you're practicing more of the Stoic mindset, the word Stoic means to be devoid of emotion or to be like calm, right? Which I think is actually a misnomer for what the Stoics believed.
Mm.
I don't think they had any problem having a great time eating good food. It's like they would just practice eating simple food once in a while to remind themselves like it's not food that's going to make them happy.
Mm.
Um, like the I'm trying to think of like how to encapsulate this well, but I think you're looking as a Stoic at the emotion, and you're looking for the meaning and purpose of it, and you are maybe choosing
Mm.
to not react to other people's emotions. But I think we would all look up to men and women who are calm in the face of adversity.
Mm.
And sometimes the way to do that is by behavioral deconditioning. And by negative visualizations, we can behavioral decondition scary events. And we can prepare ourselves for battle or prepare ourselves for loss, right? And so the ability to prepare yourself, like there's one part in Marcus Aurelius' meditations, which is like, when you wake up in the morning, tell yourself today people will be surly, ungrateful, resentful, bitter, and that you, in the face of it, will stay calm. And it goes on, but it's this idea in my mind to prepare yourself for these moments in the day where people will be upset and angry, and that you have mentally prepared yourself for that moment, right?
Mm.
To not be reactive, to not take on their anger and react with more anger. I think that's just brilliant. I mean, you have to imagine this guy was like a Roman emperor at the height of the Roman Empire. And life was tough. War, Germanic tribes, he's up there battling. His son, he probably knows, is not the greatest. Can't blame him. He probably didn't have much to do with the raising of his son. So he's got all of these issues going on. It's like we think we have problems. Imagine having like 100 problems every day. It's like some of the corporate executives I take care of. It's like, how many lawsuits are you in right now? Oh, 10,000. Okay. Yeah, your life is different. So just extreme pressure, right? But the pressure, like you can slowly acclimatize yourself to increasing pressure. Okay, for example, coming back to the squat, the deadlift, stuff like that, right? For most athletes, they have a point where they get nervous and they think like, okay, if I go above 405 for deadlift, like that is really heavy, right? And psychologically, it becomes like a psychological wall of sorts. The above that weight comes the fear, right? So they may have the capacity to do it, but the fear will actually weaken the body because the dissociation weakens the muscle, makes our muscles go limp, right? So we have to stay in the fight mode. So how do you slowly decondition yourself so that you're ready to lift that? Well, you flirt around that weight and you go up very slowly. Maybe you add 1 pound at a time, but it's slow deconditioning over time. It's fear deconditioning. I think that's what the Stoics were talking about a lot of the time. It's like, how do we slowly decondition our fears so we're not fearing them in the same way? It's fear deconditioning. It's a behavioral therapy. It really is what it is. And it's cognitive therapy as well, because they're putting those thoughts on trial, putting those fears on trial, looking at them slightly different.
Yeah, and you mentioned in the book club podcast you did covering this book, and I didn't know this, that that his writings weren't made to be public. They were just like his kind of journal entries. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the way I understand it. I understand it like, these were the sayings that he wrote for himself to read and to remind himself of things that he valued. So the first couple sections are like gratitude remembrances. It's like, I'm grateful for this person for this. I'm grateful for this person for this, you know? And I imagine him reading that to himself.
Yeah. Where do you think, do you have an idea, and this is just pure curiosity, do you know kind of who he was influenced by or who his teachers were that would have led maybe to the development of this, or just like the facilitation of it? Or do you think he was just, as the kids would say, built different?
No, he had great rhetoricians and philosopher coaches. I think he was connected with other Stoics, you know, and he had read or even been mentored by great Stoics. There's a really good graphic novel on Marcus Aurelius. Maybe you could link in the show notes or something.
Sure.
It was written recently. I can find it for you if you can't find it, but it's phenomenal at distilling him in a very accessible way. Yeah, no, he was, the way that I understand him is he was identified as someone with a lot of capacity early on, and then he was given very good teachers.
Okay, I'll definitely link that down below. And I guess since you kind of mentioned one resource, we could kind of use this as an opportunity to have you provide other resources you found kind of invaluable. And I know you've done a few book clubs on the podcast. Viktor Frankl's A Man's Search for Meaning, I remember reading that a while back. I'd love to kind of revisit it. But that, and then Crime and Punishment. What resources have you found have played a tremendous kind of like role in providing perspective or providing something in your life?
Yeah, I love those books. I mean, that's a good place to start. Like, you know, I think there's so many great classics, and I think to read broadly is fantastic. I've been enjoying recently a biography on Genghis Khan, and I just read one by or I read one on Alexander the Great, and I love, like, give me the historical perspective from as many angles as you can, you know, as they study like the archaeology and the different people that wrote about these people, and they're kind of trying to figure out who wrote it. But I love Dostoevsky is one of the deepest psychological and philosophical minds you'll ever find. Brothers Karamazov, I have like 4 different versions of that on my bookshelf. If you want to skip to a part that's very interesting, jump to the Grand Inquisitor of Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. It's like in the middle of the book. It's like 2 chapters. I like Viktor Frankl quite a bit because he was actually a psychiatrist who went through the concentration camps and found meaning in the midst of suffering, and he was someone who found beauty in the midst. He found beauty in his fellow, you know, travelers as he went through that experience, and the givingness of some of them and such. Yeah, there's so many. I think, you know, if someone wants to jump into my podcast, whatever topic kind of jumped out to you, if it's one of these books or if it's the Therapeutic Alliance series. I did a whole series on the Therapeutic Alliance, which kind of goes through recent episode on transference. I don't know if you heard that one. It's a solo episode, but that's like a summation of the stuff that I really enjoy doing in therapy. It's like deeper work, and it's poorly understood by most therapists in the way that it was taught to me by Dr. Tar. And so I'm kind of like repackaging some of the things to hopefully inspire the next generation of mental health professionals.
Yeah. So you mentioned the podcast, and yeah, hopefully that's, you know, the number of mentions is reason enough for people to go check that out, along with the books you listed. And I don't know with Dostoevsky if there's a a best book to start with? I know I tried to read some of Nietzsche, and that was philosophy. Admittedly, if it's not some of the stuff I read from the Stoics, can be a bit hard to kind of work through. Is there a book you would start uh, with
I think
Dostoevsky?
I think Crime and Punishment is very readable, and if you get 100 pages into Crime and Punishment, you're going to see the way he talks about characters and the way he talks about these different ideas. It's like you can't not read it and take away
Mm.
and become more psychologically minded. The Brothers Karamazov it's really hard for some people to get into it. Like, you cannot be exhausted from your day at the end of the day and start reading that book. Like, you have to be like Saturday morning, fully caffeinated. Okay, I'm going to give it an hour, or 2 hours, and just like, you can't have social media access. You need to like get away from all of that stuff. It's like, it's a beast of a book. But it's not as hard as some of those other ones you listed.
Mm.
It's like Nietzsche is like, it's very hard,
Yeah.
I don't know. It's like, good luck. Yeah. That's why so many people have different opinions sometimes of these very difficult writers. It's like, yeah, because it's so hard to read. They're probably projecting a lot of their own stuff on it too.
Yeah, and I found that a difficult thing to kind of like a difficult obstacle at times to work through is you rely largely on people who can interpret information for you. And I think I used Jordan Peterson as an example earlier on in the podcast, and I've kind of listened to his lecture series on his biblical lecture series, and it's like I don't know how well I'd be able to read the Bible and then interpret it in a way that can make sense of the culture of the time period and add such rich context. So listening to him talk about it, like, that resonates because it's all been processed and updated for, like, someone like myself to understand more fully and appreciate. And I find I've had to do that with a lot of people, but again, you kind of place someone in between the primary source, which is like quote unquote primary, and then your reading of it, and some stuff can get lost or changed or misinterpreted. So I guess it's like a natural consequence.
Yeah. Now, you can, we used to have Spark Notes to summarize books, right? Now we have Chat GPT.
Yeah.
And honestly, sometimes it's not bad, especially for the old stuff. And it can be a kind of a way to get a quick summary.
Oh, interesting.
I'll do that with my kids. I'll put in, like, create a story about us going back in a time machine to visit Marcus Aurelius and have Marcus Aurelius teach us some things, use actual quotes from his writing, and have us be part of the story.
Wow.
And it creates a really interesting story. And then, it's a way of introducing my kids to these big thinkers, and we'll do it several times, like with the same person. So I'm my kids are like 7 and 9. So they're slowly getting used to some of these names and some of their ideas at a young age, which is fun.
Yeah. Okay. I could only imagine having been exposed to Marcus Aurelius when I was 7, 8, 9. I don't know.
I would, it's like, oh man, I've gotten my daughter to read this, like, the History of the World book. It's like a classical book that goes through like different great people in different societies. And I'm like, I wish I had read that, because I always wondered what was going on, what was going on the same time the Romans were there, what was going on in China, what was going on in Japan. It's like, I didn't know. So I think it's like, I'm just so hungry to learn still. And it's fun to do that through their eyes.
Yeah, no, I feel the same way. I kind of got a late jump on my education. And it's funny, you mentioned earlier on that you had you like to read certain autobiographies to kind of get like a snapshot of the historical context within which events took place, and people kind of experience life the way they did. And I remember one of the first books I read that had a kind of a big influence on me, and I went down this direction for a little bit, but it was Martin Luther King Jr. was his autobiography. I read that. I read Malcolm X's autobiography, and then I kind of just started working through like some of these civil rights activists. I think Medgar Evers was one of them. There's this book, I forget the name of the guy, but I think it was Black Like Me, but it was this guy who took a drug to change the color of his skin, and then he lived in like the French quarters in Louisiana, like New Orleans, or someplace in the deep South, and I kind of went down this rabbit hole of reading books like that, and I would go to the library. I usually say this more in on the philosophy side of things, but I would just go to the library, go to the philosophy section, go to the autobiography section,
Hmm.
look at
Yep.
Emerson or Abraham Lincoln, and I would just like pick books out and just like, I don't know. They're really fascinating. I didn't never really had like an ultimate end for it. Like I'm not reading this to gain anything. It was just more curiosity driven.
There's studies that show that it increases empathy.
Mm.
Because imagine, you're a white guy, right? I mean, I can't see your face right now.
Yeah, I'm white.
Um, after reading 5 or 6 books by people and hearing their struggles, it's like you have a framework now for
Mm.
understanding something you did not ever experience or ever understand before. That can allow you to have deeper conversations with people who might be going through something similar, or might be struggling with like what that meant for them to have grandparents that were slaves. So I think it increases empathy. There's data to support that. So if there's any topic that I feel like is very hard for me to understand,
Mm.
and I have maybe judgment or, you know, um, it's like, yeah, read a biography on that person, and see, and like often we get sound bites nowadays. And so, audiobooks for me is really cool because then it's like
Yeah.
I'm consuming it while I go for a walk or while I drive home. And I used to try to read like a book a week on Audible,
Wow.
but it's not been that good. But at the end of the year, I would have a list of like 50, 60 books that I've gotten through.
Mm.
Um, and I once, I've talked to people who are like, I want to be a history teacher when I grow up. And I say like, look, how, if you read a book a week about history, in 10 years, you'll have read 100, let's see, 10 years, 50 a year. Okay. So 10 years, you will have read 500 books. Like, how much of a better history teacher would you
Mm.
be than if you had read 1 book a year or 2 books a year?
Right. Right.
And I think the same thing is true for, like if you're a coach. And so it's like you interact with so many different types of people.
Mm.
It's like if you want to be the best of the best, it's like not only do you have to know everything that there is to know about strength training and fitness and all that stuff, but you need to know people and
Mm.
the new generations coming through because they're different. It's like how are the generations changing and why? And how can we continue to connect with people that are of different experiences than ourselves?
Well, and I don't know if I've been able to. I think I've reflected quite a bit more as of late, but I had this thought last night because I started Russ Harris's book, The Happiness Trap, and I was listening to a few podcasts with him, and then before that, I just listened to a few other episodes with people from various backgrounds, and I was kind of thinking as I was listening to it, I'm like, the fact that I can listen to someone talk about ACT or someone to talk about how you are not necessarily your thoughts, you're experiencing your thoughts. And I like the kind of image used generally of like you're the mountain and the weather can change around the mountain or on the mountain, but you aren't the weather, you're just the mountain kind of experiencing the weather. And it's like it's so fascinating that I could listen to or read content about all of this stuff that I don't know if you would be inclined to think about more organically, just like, and maybe that's the kind of the wisdom traditions, that's where they started to develop these ideas or thoughts around what I'm talking about. But like to just have so many resources and so many people and so many ways of conceptualizing it and understanding it, and to have not free access, but with Sci-Hub, I've read, I don't know, thousands of, maybe hundreds and hundreds of thousands of research articles for
Hmm.
free. I've never paid a dime for a research article. And then I bought so many books on Audible, gone to the library and just read so many books. And it's all allowed me to develop a more comprehensive perspective. And then, on my end, develop more empathy for people in different situations. And you mentioned that how, I read Roots years and years ago, and I remember I read that in like 2 weeks, and I don't know how many pages it is. It's well over 500, but it was so good and so interesting. And to take that and to kind of integrate it into myself. And now when I go out, I'm like really curious and interested in other people and knowing who they are and what they've experienced. And I think it provides a lot of that, provides a lot of context. So if you have this like, not hatred, but like this dislike towards certain groups or certain types of people or people with different preferences, and you get to know them and it humanizes that preference.
Oh yeah.
It definitely softens that quite a bit more to where you're just like, we're just all people experiencing this thing. And the way you want to do that is different from the way I want to do it. Neither are right, neither are wrong. They're just kind of what is. And like, to be fair, I would say most people would likely be better off resistance training and paying attention to their nutrition, all these things. But like, if you don't want to do that too, that's okay. Like that's your call.
Yeah, there was I think it comes down to what people's goals are, and what the best goal for them given their desires. I think, yeah, maybe we can do a part 2 because I gotta jump into another meeting. But
yeah, yeah, I really appreciate it. And I didn't mean for this to like stretch into a post podcast kind of like discussion, but I'd love to do a part 2. Yeah, for everyone listening, go check out Dr. Puder's stuff. It's incredible. If you want to follow me, Josh_PhilWL on Instagram, Philosophical Weightlifting everywhere else. We will catch you guys on the next episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast.